Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo. I'm the founding partner at Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm that's really focused on trying to address the complex development challenges we face in the continent. So today it's my pleasure to discuss with Professor Chidi Odinkalu. And, you know, it's all about democracy, which Abraham Lincoln explains or describes as government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But it appears that in Africa today, what we have is government of the elite, enabled by the judiciary, and for the privileged few. And that's the subject of our conversation today. And I'd really like to unpack this with Professor Chidi Odinkalu, who recently published a book, The Selectorate, When the Judiciary Topple the People. Professor Odinkalu, you're welcome.
Thank you, Patrick, for having me. And thank you also for the work that you do.
Thank you very much. And interestingly, just about a year ago, you were my guest on this program, and I'm happy to have you back, and congratulations on the new book. If you can, please, just kind of unpack for us the central thesis of the book.
No, thanks a lot. No, the thesis is actually quite simple, fairly straightforward, with several subtexts, but we can get to explore those later. The underlying thesis is fundamentally Section 14 of the Constitution tells us, the Nigerian Constitution, it tells us that sovereignty belongs to the people. And as a matter, whether you look at the Universal Declaration or the African Charter, government derives its mandate to govern, or indeed basic political science principles. It derives its mandate to govern from the people. Mm-hmm. And how do the people express or convey that mandate or communicate it? Through periodic ballots. And for that, we organize elections, and the winner of the elections acquires the mandate to rule, essentially. Thus far, no problem. The challenge is that increasingly across African countries, and it's not just in Nigeria, although Nigeria is probably the origin of the species, across African countries, increasingly, elections are no longer settled in the polling units, they're settled in courtrooms. And with that comes not just problems for the mandate to govern, for electoral legitimacy or popular legitimacy as the foundation of the mandate to govern. With that also comes massive distortions and dysfunctions in the nature of the judicial office and judicial function. And so you have this double whammy, which then cascades down to wider problems of political stability and of democratic legitimacy and governmental performance. And that's exactly where we are. And that's why I thought it was important to unpack how this came about on the continent, starting from Nigeria where it began, and then explore incrementally going forward the consequences for democratic government in Africa.
When you talk about the Selectorate, you situate it with the judges, the judiciary. Can you trace for us the origins of this? Because there's a chance that people might think that this is something that happened in 2023 or more recently. But can you, for instance, trace for us the historical roots of where the judges then begin to assume powers that should ordinarily be with the electorate?
What I do in the book is quite deliberate, which is simply unfold the narrative and let people reach their conclusions. And I deliberately step away from providing conclusions, and that's very deliberate. But really, the book pursues two related narratives. One is the evolution of the institutional notions of institutional independence or lack of it in the Nigerian judiciary. The other is the evolution of this problem of judicial immersion in election dispute resolution. And now, judicial immersion in election dispute resolution is at two levels. There is the retail dimension, which is disputations over constituency elections. For the most part, that's been with us since at least 1959.
Okay.
However, because the constituencies are delimited and discrete, it never really rose to the level of a major problem. And there were 20 years between the 1959 general elections and the 1979 general elections. And what was new in 1979 was that we had one single constituency election for all of the country. That was introduced by presidentialism. So in the presidential election, the presidency is a national constituency election. And dispute resolution that for that purpose is therefore to scale, which was new to the country. Now, that is where the problem of electoral dysfunction started, which had consequences for the judiciary. But the story about judicial independence and its dysfunction started earlier. And it started effectively with the decentralization of the judiciary in 1954, following the London-Lagos Constitutional Conferences. And when you read the book, you will find out that that caused so much problem that the Chief Justice at the point, John Verity, resigned. And because he was against the decentralization of the judiciary, fearing that that was going to precisely politicize the judiciary and defang it in exactly the way it did, actually. To that extent, he was right. But the issue of the relationship of judiciary to elections probably goes back to 1958, the succession to John Foster Sutton, who was the last colonial era expatriate Chief Justice of Nigeria, the succession that brought Adetokunbo Ademola to office as Chief Justice. Because in that, the politics was such that people did not want Olumuyiwa Jibowu to be Chief Justice, and he was eliminated in a story for those who read the book will probably discover. And Adetokunbo Ademola, who was seen as a more emollient character, was then installed as Chief Justice. Now, some things then happened in the immediate aftermath of independence. The crisis in the Western region ended up in the case of Adegbenro and Akintola, which was the case in which the action group sought to oust Akintola as premier of the Western region. And the Akintola in that case was allied with the NPC, the Northern People's Congress at the center, and the NCNC of Zeke. And so the NCNC, NNDP, that's Akintola, and NPC coalition lost that case at the Privy Council on the law. So what did they do? They abolished the decision, and they abolished appeals to the Privy Council. And so when you see, this is also part of, and if you read the book, you see that I complain about our pedagogy, how we teach law. Yeah. Because we teach ourselves, oh, well, we became a republic in 1963. Nobody knows, or most students are not taught, that the reason we became a republic was the ruling government lost a case to the highest court and decided to abolish the court and the judgment. And that is really what we've lived with. We've lived with the consequences of that since then. They did so they abolished the decision, they abolished the court, converted it into a republic, and they did one more thing. They abolished the Judicial Service Commission. And with that, they started taking over the judiciary. The Judicial Service Commission did not return until 1979. But in 1979, a presidential election, which is the second strand of the story, ended up before the Supreme Court. Now, everybody remembers the decision in Shagari, Awolowo and Shagari, because it was iconic and everybody remembers it as the 12 to 3rds case. Correct. Many people here, I suspect, listening to us will not know what 12 to 3rds mean, because a majority of Nigerians were born after 1979. So I don't know whether you will indulge me, but I think I want to provide that context. Sure. In 1979, Nigeria had 19 states. There was a presidential election. And the military decided that in order to win the election, the candidate had to first get the highest number of votes, and in addition, had to get at least 25% of the votes cast in at least 2/3 of the states of the Federation. But 19 does not resolve into 2/3 as a whole number. President Shehu Shagari, who was declared the winner, won 25% of the votes in 12 states. In the 13th state, which was Kano, he won just under 20% of the votes. On his behalf in the Supreme Court, it was argued that in order to find 12 2/3, you had to take the 13th state, break it up into 2/3, and find 25% of the 2/3. And if you did that, then he met the threshold. If you didn't, as Awolowo argued, he failed to meet the threshold. The Supreme Court, by a majority of 6-1, resolved in favor of Shagari that the arithmetic was that you had to find 25% of 2/3 of Kano State. And therefore, he won. And the jurisprudence and the reasoning was so iconic. Everybody remembers 12 2/3. But that is not what is relevant in my view. As exciting as that jurisprudence was, what happened, the consequence of Awolowo and Shagari, or the abiding issue for me, was how it destabilized the judiciary in two ways. Number one, after the military came to power in 1975, they fired the then Chief Justice, Taslim Elias, and appointed an expatriate, Sadanli Alexander, as the Chief Justice. He was on a contract for 3 years, which was to end in 1978. We were then to do presidential elections in 1979, have dispute resolution, and the winner would be installed. But in 1978, his contract was extended by 1 year. The country voted on the 11th of August, 1979. 16th of August, the results were announced. The Chief Justice was to retire on the 21st of August. And the deadline for filing of presidential petitions was the following day. On the 21st of August, two things happened. Awolowo filed his presidential petition, and Obasanjo appointed a new Chief Justice. The first thing that new Chief Justice was going to do was to resolve the presidential elections. And so the first thing became that dispute resolution in presidential elections became the subject around which you had to manage judicial succession at that very high level. And if you read the details, Awolowo and Obasanjo abused themselves, because Awolowo's claim was that Obasanjo went to Shagari, who was a party in the presidential dispute resolution, to get a candidate to be appointed, and Shagari was the person who suggested Fatai Williams, who was appointed. The second thing was that the judgment itself came down 4 days before the swearing in. And Obasanjo was fretting at that point as to what was going to be the decision. So he required the Chief Justice to tell him ahead of the judgment being announced that what the outcome was going to be. Judgment came down on the 16th, but 2 days before, on the 24th, after conferencing had finished, or shortly before conferencing was finished, Fatai Williams broke judicial conference confidentiality and told Obasanjo of the decision. Those two things have lived with us since then.
Then Obasanjo shows up again in 99.
Yes.
And in the book, you tell the story of the Oba brothers. You start with the story of the Oba brothers and how that also then entrenches the Selectorate in Nigeria. Maybe that's a good story to recount, to show where we are today, or how we got to the point of where we are today.
That is the the third landmark in the evolution of this story. Because in 2003, which is really yes, where the toxic dimension begins. In 2003, this was the election for the Anambra South senatorial zone. And the candidate, coincidentally, was a man called Nicholas Ukachukwu. Today, he's running as the APC governorship candidate for Anambra State. Then correct, he ran for the Senate to represent Anambra South. He won on the platform of the PDP. But at the time, there was a young man, relatively then, who was a presidential assistant. He was actually SA Domestic Matters to the President. His name was Andy Oba. He was much more influential than his official designation suggested. Andy, after INEC had announced the results declaring Nicholas Ukachukwu as winner, Andy procured INEC in Abuja to set aside that result administratively. Mind you, at that point, the only person who could do that or entity was the Election Petition Tribunal. Andy procured INEC to set aside that result and announced his elder brother, Ugochukwu as the winner. The problem was that Ugochukwu was not a candidate in the election. He was not on the ballot. He had never contested for the office. So INEC in Abuja announced as the winner of the election a man who was not on the ballot and whom the people had never had the opportunity to consider. As an open and short case, this was easy. Nicholas Ukachukwu went to court, and the first instance tribunal upheld his case. From there, they went on appeal. And at the appeal was comprised, the appellate panel comprised 3 justices of the Court of Appeal, Opene presiding, Akas and Adeniji as associate justices. And Andy Uba, I'm saying this because this was actually affirmed and validated by high-level judicial inquiry by the NJC. So I'm not saying anything that is defamatory, and it's in the book. Andy Uba and his brothers, that is Ugochukwu Uba, and the younger brother, Chris Uba, bought 2 of the 3 justices. To Justice Opene, they gave 16 million naira, which at that point was a heck of a lot of money. To Justice Adeniji, they gave 12 million naira. Both of them also got houses in Abuja. Now, when they went to deliver the money in Ghana Must Go bags, the money was collected by the driver, who then hefted the bags to the justices where they were sitting. And if they had been a little more humane, we would not have known of this story, but they gave the driver only 10,000 naira for his efforts, and that's what undid them. If you're listening to this, please, when you collect money, share it properly. That's the moral of this story.
That's the moral of the story.
Yeah, you know. Now, the driver then squealed on them, and the investigation began. And I should complete this story. There was a 3rd justice, Kumai Akas. Justice Akas refused the importunation and declined the bribe. And he decided according to his conscience. But the 2 justices who accepted the bribe ruled in favor of the man who had not contested the election, Ugochukwu Uba. The man who did not collect the bribe ruled against Ugochukwu Uba. So Ugochukwu Uba won on a majority 2-1 vote of the Justice of Appeal, went on to serve a term in the Senate. That was where this began, because it became evident that you could become a winner of an election in which you are not a candidate if the judges said so. And the man who then made that the modus operandi for electoral victory in Nigeria was a man called Ubanese Alphonse Ibeke. Ubanese went to the parliament, to the National Assembly 3 times without ever having won an election. And on 2 occasions, he didn't even run. In 2003, he won after 2.5 years in court. In 2010, he went to the Senate and toppled Joy Emodi after Senator Emodi had been in Senate for 3 years plus. And in 2011, he got a High Court judge to give him an injunction, sending him again to the Senate. And because that was so corrupt, it was so evident, the Attorney General at the point then prosecuted him for fraud. Now, but by then, this modus operandi had left these two guys and had become federalized. And to such a scale, it is no longer possible to control. But this is really the origin of the species here.
And, you know, the chapter on Obanes could be a Nollywood movie any day. I mean, I totally enjoyed reading it, you know, although it was really painful to see where we've gotten to. But what is it about our history or our traditions, our culture, that has made this really terrible system stick with us? And maybe also in addressing this, maybe you can touch on another issue that you really dealt on in the book, which is where the judges have started appointing their sons and daughters and family members to judgeships in Nigeria, further entrenching this challenge that we have?
You know, having trained as a lawyer, I want to say something that a lot of lawyers may not find very happy, but I think may not be very happy with. But the thing that has entrenched this, in my view, is the teaching of law, the way we teach law. We teach law as doctrine. And you see, learning by the rote. When you repeat doctrine and repeat doctrine and repeat doctrine, you program people against curiosity and against intellectual honesty, against facts and against evidence. Okay? So, first of all, we have programmed people in two ways. Number one, we program law graduates to believe that judges are a superior breed. They can do no wrong. My lord, your worship. And, you know, all that obsequiousness then precludes people from looking at the evidence of corruption before them. The evidence of things that should not happen. So we do not actually challenge things that we know. Instead, because those things are too disconcerting, we are more comfortable with simply spouting the things that judges say. Okay, no matter how bad those things are, and no matter how unreasonable. So if you take the case of the Uba brothers, the Ugochukwu Uba and Nicholas Ukachukwu case, after that judgment sending Ugochukwu Uba to the Senate, there was a complaint to the National Judicial Council. The National Judicial Council investigated, found as a fact that the judgment had been procured by corruption. They recommended the dismissal of the two justices of appeal who collected bribes. They were in fact dismissed for judicial corruption. Then the people affected by that corruption appealed. The Court of Appeal said, we have decided the case, we cannot reopen it. But that is stupid. That is clearly stupid. I'm sorry, there's no other way to put it. If a judgment has been procured by manifest fraud, affirmed by the National Judicial Council, how is it a judgment? But lawyers are encouraged to cite this and say it is precedent. It cannot be precedent. And if you say anything about it, they say you don't respect judges. And so we are taught not to be curious citizens. And that becomes the standard. So legal pedagogy is problematic. And this begins from the origin. You know, you start with legal system, administrative law, constitutional law. You are taught that judges are gods. Infallible. That notion then undermines imagination. And really, for anybody who is a law teacher here, I do think there's such a crisis with our pedagogy of law that everything needs to be torn down and rebuilt. And that, for me, really is why, as a law teacher, I no longer teach doctrine. I teach law as narration, as historical narration. So when you unbundle the actors and just follow the story, you will discover things that will shock you. So I'll give you an example. That, you know, most lawyers in Nigeria know of a case called Mojeku and Mojeku, which comes from Newi, of a widow whom the Court of Appeal liberated in 1997 with fancy, you know, jurisprudence that appears fantastic, that says a woman is entitled to inherit the late husband's estate. Yes, and it's done in such flowery language by Justice Nikki Toby, God bless his soul. Everybody cites it. But you see, most of the law professors will teach this, and what they will not teach you is that that woman's husband died in 1963. She started litigating in 1966, and she got judgment in 1997. Add the years. What does it give you? It gives you 34 years of widowhood or 31 years of litigation. So you ask yourself the question, who wants to litigate for 31 years in order to get fancy jurisprudence? How many widows will survive for 31 years? If you ask that question that way, you will no longer celebrate that decision. You see it as a crisis for the Nigerian legal system. And you can then challenge your students. How can we make sure that no widow has to stay in court for 31 years? You will no longer be adulatory about that jurisprudence. You will be developmental about the jurisprudence. It changes your optics. It changes your methodology. It challenges you as a development actor. It challenges you as an intellectual and strategic leader. But our law teachers will not do that. They will rather adulate about the decision and miss the opportunity to transform our possibilities. This is, for me, the first thing. We've got to change the way we teach our young people. We've got to recognize that the role of a teacher is to inspire, to reimagine society. And in that, we are failing ourselves. The second thing is to not accept the opportunity, the challenge of institutional reform. So we teach our students that we got independent institutions at independence. That was a lie. That is a lie from the pit of hell, because colonialism was founded on dependency. Colonialism did not know judicial independence, so it could not have bequeathed to you what it did not have. Why is this so serious? Because if you realize you don't have independent institutions, you will work hard to create that as a political objective. But because we've come out believing we had independent institutions when we did not, we have lost everything. And so part of the objective really of the book at its foundations is to challenge us to accept the political project of evolving independent institutions. And that is a very serious thing.
And you make that point very clearly in the prologue of the book, beautifully argued, beautifully presented. And in the book as well, you shared examples from other African countries, so stating that this is not really a Nigerian problem, but it's something that's manifested quite dominantly in Nigeria, but can very easily be exported to other African countries. So can you speak to some of the examples from other African countries where we have similar challenges?
Well, I mean, it's in a lot of places. Uganda is the one I find exciting because Museveni used to be my friend. And I mean, in 2006, Museveni lost the elections to Kizza Besigye. The case ended up before the Ugandan Supreme Court, and by then he had appointed Ben Odoki, who partly comes from Kenya, partly comes from Uganda, comes from a place called Busia, on the border between Kenya and Uganda, appoints Ben Odoki as the Chief Justice. And Ben Odoki, of course, had come through although he was first appointed a judge by Idi Amin, Odoki had actually become dependent by this time on Museveni. And so, and Besigye's case was very clear. The evidence was very clear. The law was very clear. The Ugandan Supreme Court actually affirmed everything as a matter of law and evidence that Besigye claimed. However, after conference, the president of Uganda actually contacts the Chief Justice. After conference, the court was split 4-3 in favor of upholding, of declaring Kizza Besigye as the winner of the election. Like Nigeria did in 1979, Museveni surrounds the Supreme Court of Uganda with soldiers and tells the Chief Justice that, quite literally, if they decide that kind of thing, he cannot guarantee their safety. So a vote switches. And on the day, the Supreme Court of Uganda actually then declares that Museveni won the election. But all the facts and evidence they upheld in favor of Kizza Besigye. So basically, when you read the judgment, you read it, and then up to the point where the court makes its dispositive orders, it's looking like Besigye is the winner, and then the orders flip, and Museveni walks away with victory. Now, if you go to Ghana, in 2013, the presidential contest went to court between John Mahama, the current president, and Nana Akufo-Addo, the man whom he succeeded. And on the day of the judgment in August 2013, the Supreme Court of Ghana announced a majority of 6-3. The day after, the Supreme Court of Ghana issues a statement saying actually it was a majority of 5-4 in favor of President Mahama, who had succeeded Jonathan Mills, who died. And then the Supreme Court of Ghana the following week releases its judgments, the text of the judgments and the orders made by the court. And when you read through the judgments, 6 out of the 9 justices actually ordered reruns or revotes in either all of the country or parts of the country. So actually, Nana Akufo-Addo won that election, won the contest, but the announcement put out by the court meant that Mahama had already been installed because the impression was created that he won. But if 6 justices ordered revotes, he could not have been installed on that judgment.
Exactly.
Now, and of course, those who followed what happened in Mali, because people will think, okay, this is a common law problem. I don't want to go to Kenya or Malawi or Zimbabwe for people can read that up in the book. But if you look at Mali, in the 2020 election, the ruling party won, but they did not have enough seats to change the constitution. So they started using the Constitutional Court to steal the constituencies won by the opposition. They stole 31 of their seats. The opposition had nowhere else to go. They went to the streets. As they started protesting, the Islamists joined them. And ECOWAS then intervened and designated President Jonathan to go and help mediate. And Jonathan, by the time he got there, things had already advanced. Jonathan proposed, okay, let us change the Constitutional Court so that they no longer have to do this kind of thing again. The people refused. They said they now wanted the Constitutional Court abolished. But by the time Jonathan could get authorization to negotiate that point, things had already gone beyond the control of anybody. What happened? The constitution was toppled. And that is how Mali ended up in military rule. And the thing about judicial selectoralism is that as you begin to go down that route, government begins to lose legitimacy. And people no longer have any faith in anything other than self-help or popular uprising. And I think that is for me why we need to begin to worry about this, because it's got to the point where it could head us off right off the cliff edge.
And I think that's, in my view, that's the most important point that the book makes. But just to wrap up this section, do you think that this is really an African problem, or do you see it emerging in other parts of the world? So, for instance, in the US, Bush versus Gore, or maybe some places in Latin America, have you seen this trend, maybe in weak or emerging democracies, or is this purely an African construct?
Well, I mean, in parliamentary systems, of course, this is unlikely to happen because of the nature of parliamentary constituency delimitation. But if you have parliamentary presidentialism, which is the kind of thing you have in Kenya, then of course you can see that it's creeping up in Kenya in some form. Now, in the US, actually, the US Supreme Court stepped back from it. I know a lot of people don't like the outcome of Bush and Gore, but doctrinally, the US Supreme Court stepped back from venturing beyond that point in Bush v. Gore in 2000. And they actually said precisely that the design of the Constitution of the United States was that the decision as to who became president should be in the hands of the people, not in the hands of judges. And so they declined to get involved in doing that. Of course, courts do have a role in dispute resolution with respect to elections, and that's part of the point I try to argue in the book. But the role of the courts is to supervise the rules so that the contest can take place. So elections, by definition in political science, democratic elections are indeterminate until the votes are counted. And the indeterminacy is policed by determinate rules. In a selectoralist system, the rules become indeterminate so that elections become predetermined. So the cone is inverted. And that inversion of the cone is what you see in a lot of our parts. It is easier in transitional democracies. Latin America is a lot more difficult because many of them also have the two-stage presidential system. So you have a first round elections and then a second round of elections. And certification after that is done by the Constitutional Court. That's the second thing. That means that the Electoral Commission, or howsoever the electoral management body is defined, has to go to the Constitutional Court to prove that there has been substantial compliance with the rules. Now, in 2008, and if they prove that, by the way, the Constitutional Court then validates the election before you announce. In 2008, Justice Uwais' electoral reform panel actually recommended that instead of asking the person who has been declared loser to prove that the elections were rigged, it should be up to INEC to first prove that the elections were in substantial compliance with the law before the burden shifts. So in terms of this thing, I mean, if you look at the jurisprudence from India as well, the Indian Supreme Court, although it's also parliamentary for the most part, the Indian Supreme Court has said no, their role is to police the rules. In our system, in many African countries, the judges no longer want to police the rules. They want to announce the outcomes.
So maybe one more question before we move to solutions. Is it fair to argue that what we get as a selectorate is a natural progression from corruption? So corruption becomes the base. And by corruption here, I'm going back to a question I asked, which I'm not sure you addressed, where judges are now appointing family members, and not based on merit, not based on any of that, but just, filial connections. And that selectorism is just a natural progression. So once you don't deal with corruption, once you don't deal with all this nepotism and so on, you're going to get to this stage where you have a selectorate. And when you get here, then probably the next stage to that is where democracy falls apart and all kinds of illiberal governments take form. Am I reading it right?
I'd probably say I probably totally agree with you. If this happened on the stock exchange, all these guys will go in for insider dealing.
Yep.
Right. Not all of them will be jailbirds.
Yep.
Right. Now, in 1972, when 1970, when Adeneko Ademola was appointed a judge of the High Court, his father, Justice Adeneko Ademola, was the Chief Justice of Nigeria. It was unheard of. And it was military under military rule. Nobody could have disputed that intellectually he was qualified, but a lot of people were still a little disturbed by that. But you see, the country was still so good that Adeneko Ademola never made it beyond the Court of Appeal because there were issues of integrity connected with the management of the Shodigbo estate, in which he was an executor, that precluded him from going to the Supreme Court, despite the fact that his father was that powerful. Now, since between 1970 and 2007, we avoided a repeat. No, so you did not have sons and daughters of serving judges becoming the successors to their parents. And that's why I mourn the late Chief Justice Lawal Uwais, because he was on Supreme Court for 27 years, Chief Justice for 11. He could have made his entire village judges. He didn't. His wife became a lawyer in 1981. As I speak to you, at least 5 members of the Supreme Court of Nigeria were in her set.
Yeah.
Including the current Chief Justice and
Correct.
the Chief Justice before him, or before her, and the Chief Justice before that one. So we've had 3 Chief Justices in succession who came from the 1981 set of the Nigerian Law School. And in that set, you had the wife of Chief Justice Uwais. So if he had appointed his wife a judge, or if he had chosen to do that as they are now doing, nobody would have quarreled, but he didn't. Now, when Belgore became Chief Justice in 2007, that began to change. And then his successor, Chief Justice Kutigi, appointed 2 of his children as judges. One of them is now a justice of the Supreme Court. And God keeping him alive, by 2035, he will become Chief Justice of Nigeria, the first second-generation Chief Justice of Nigeria. Okay? Now, and you can now go forward from there and begin to see the business of how these people are trading appointments. And when you look, for instance, at the latest appointments into the Abuja High Court, there were 12 appointments. Of that, 8 went to judicial insiders and political insiders. Less than week, the Abuja minister got 1. The Chief Justice who did the appointments got 1. His immediate predecessor got 1, their daughters. The Chief Justice who did the appointment got his daughter-in-law. Nyesom Wike got his sister-in-law. The Chief Justice preceding the Chief Justice who did that got his daughter appointed. There was the Abuja chief judge had his daughter appointed. The chief judge, the penultimate chief judge of Abuja got his daughter appointed. The former chief judge of Benue State had his son appointed. As I said, 8 of them out of 12, which then begs the question, when are we going to get qualified judges? And as these things begin to happen, people then begin to lock in their benefits in terms of trading outcomes in political cases. And you will notice, for instance, that in 2023, when the parties did their primaries, the Chief Justice, who had been there at the time of the primaries, one of his sons got a ticket to Senate from one party. Yep. Another of his sons got a ticket to the House of Representatives from the other party. And the president of the Court of Appeal in 2019, who constituted the election petition tribunals, her husband got the ticket to go to the Senate in 2019. And the daughter got appointed a High Court judge subsequently. And that was the husband who announced on the floor of the Senate in 2023 that he had been dictating to his wife how to write judgments for the benefit of his colleagues. Are we surprised? Are we surprised?
So Chidi, let's switch gears here. Let's talk solutions, right? So the Judicial Commission should be responsible for ensuring that these things don't happen. Why is it that it's ineffective in this case? And what are some of the ways we can build up accountability mechanisms to ensure that the judges do litigate electoral cases based on evidence and not based on who has procured them?
First of all, I think we've got to recognize this is not going to change by magic. Judicial tenure is very protected. And if you're appointing, as some of these kids have been appointing at 32, 33, 34, these young people, you are looking at a judicial tenure, a judicial shelf life of between 35 and 37 years. You've got to step back and ask very brutal questions, right? So that's the first thing. People are locking in intergenerational benefits at our expense. So the first thing, and that's why I write this book the way I do, the first thing is we've got to take this thing out of the hands of lawyers and judges. As long as we continue to think that this will be fixed by lawyers and judges, we will not have a solution. This is a problem for citizens and communities, and we have got to take this issue to the streets. We've got to build and continue building critical mass. So the problem of judicial independence and judicial selectoralism is not going to be fixed as a technical issue. It has become political on the scale that is happening in Nigeria. That's the first thing. And that means, therefore, that we've got to break it down in ways citizens can understand, so that we understand why this is our problem, not an issue for lawyers to fix. It is too important for lawyers and judges and politicians to fix by themselves. But there are some parts that we can easily address. Number one, judicial appointments. I'm glad that the Chief Justice, because everybody says we've got to amend the Constitution, we don't have to amend nothing. There is no reason why we will need to do judicial appointment the way we are doing it, which is like Oboni's secret society. Okay? You are appointing people who decide who rules us, and you don't want us to participate. So for the first time now in this last round of appointments, they said, well, you can invite citizens to write letters. Every letter has to be under affidavit and all of that. And they say they got 85 letters, of which only 1 counted in the appointments. Well, that's not good enough. Can we have transparent judicial appointments and transparent interviews? That can be done by the National Judicial Council. In fact, that can be done by the Chief Justice by subsidiary rules on her own. Very simple. And let us see all the letters written, so that it is not just the judges who are insiders who are dealing with it. There are things, I just don't want to go into some details here because it's not necessary to make the point, but transparency in appointments, that's number one. Number two, we need information on recusals. We cannot have a situation in which a Chief Justice is presiding to appoint their son or daughter as a judge, and then we think it is normal, and we don't have public declaration of what has transpired in that case. I do think that needs to change. We need to have the practice on recusals in appointments clearly stated and clearly administered. The third thing is there are two bodies now at the federal level dealing with this issue. One is the National Judicial Council, which is the highest body. The other is the Judicial Service Commission, which makes recommendations to the National Judicial Council. And what you do have now, for instance, in 2017, there was an appointment to be made to the Supreme Court. And one justice of the Court of Appeal, and the slot was for the North Central Zone. A justice of the Court of Appeal, female, was recommended by the Federal Judicial Service Commission as the top candidate. Another guy, male, was the alternate. The list went to the National Judicial Council. By the time he left there, they flipped it around. The justice of the court, the woman who had been recommended had been thrown away, and the man who was an alternate was made the judge, the justice of the Supreme Court. No reasons were proffered. And that if that woman had gone ahead, she would have been in line to be Chief Justice of Nigeria, but she was eliminated. Now, there's a lot of wheeling and dealing that goes on at the National Judicial Council, and that is where the insider dealing takes place. Do you know why? Every appointee in the National Judicial Council is owned by the Chief Justice. Now, it is called, the acronym is NJC for the National Judicial Council and CJN for the Chief Justice. And what is it? People have just moved around the deck chairs of letters. CJN is NJC, the same letters. And the CJN totally owns the NJC. The only person whom notionally, or whom the CJN does not appoint are the representatives, the 5 representatives of the Nigerian Bar Association. But now you see, when the Chief Justice, the last Chief Justice, did not like the president of the Nigerian Bar Association, that's Olumide.
Yes.
He threw him out.
Yes.
Yes, Olumide Akpata.
Yes.
And that tells you that the Chief Justice is totally in charge of the NJC. Now, however, the Judicial Service Commission is different, because the Judicial Service Commission includes the Chief Justice, the Attorney General, President of Court of Appeal, and a few other figures. But the composition is more dexterous. It's not easily manipulable. And my view is we should abolish the NJC and capacitate the Judicial Service Commission to do what the NJC does. With the contradictions in it, it is more likely to have controls. But as long as we have NJC and JSC functioning together, there'll be confusion. If, however, both of them must function, can we have the Judicial Service Commission on top of the NJC rather than the other way around? Because that would mean that you have some oversight of abuses by the NJC. You see, the NJC was designed by the military under paternalistic circumstances. And of course, it just happened that they had 2 decent men to begin with to lead it. One was Mohammed Bello, God bless his soul. The second was Mohammed Lawal Owais. They came from a different time and different discipline. It was not designed with people like Oluyikayode Ariwola in mind. And Ariwola totally showed up why the NJC has passed its sell-by date. And I do think, therefore, that we could easily dispatch the NJC, retain the JSC, or flip them around, or in addition, do something else, which is insist that the NJC is not chaired by the Chief Justice. So because at the moment, the Chief Justice chairs both the NJC and the JSC, the Judicial Service Commission. So the Chief Justice gets 2 bites at the cherry. And so one easy thing we could do is, okay, we keep those 2 institutions, but you know what? The Chief Justice chairs one, but does not chair the other. And the one that is not chaired by the Chief Justice is on top of the one that is chaired by the Chief Justice. What about? So there are, and these are very modest, conservative proposals. I'm not suggesting yet, I'm not going down the route of what Kenya did, which is total turnover of its entire corrupt judiciary in 2010, or what South Africa did, which was a supersession of the existing judiciary with a new cadre. So they left the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein and moved the Constitutional Court to Johannesburg with a totally new bench, and moved the office of the Chief Justice from the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein to the Constitutional Court in Johannesburg. That totally altered the balance, therefore, and reformed the judiciary. I'm not even going there yet. I'm saying we can be conservative and yet reclaim some trust. And at the moment, we are not even willing to imagine that.
So when you say we, you're not thinking Chidi and Patrick. You know, who's the we here?
The country. The country, Nigeria. That's why I start with the citizen.
Who in the country, Nigeria, is actually set up to do this, and who can do it? Is it the NBA? Is it the Nigerian Bar Association? No. Is it civil society? Who?
It's you and I, and the people here, from whatever the country is. You see, the NBA is already too invested. Lawyers in private practice, litigating cases before the kinds of judges who benefit from this cannot do it, because they will tell you, well, you know you can do this thing because you no longer go to court in Nigeria. If you were to go to court, your clients will suffer this, that, and the other one. And so as a result, lawyers cannot explore this issue to the fullest. This issue requires some intellectual risk and some moral risk and political capital. And we need to build up the political capital in the argumentation of the case. We cannot continue this way. And you see, the interesting thing is the politicians are now coming to me and saying, oh, thank you, but you need to help us. How am I going to help you when you're the person with political power and who's losing elections? Look at Emeka Ihedioha. He wins an election and gets stuffed out by the votes of 6 judges, 6 justices of the Supreme Court, none of whom had a vote in Imo State. And now, you see, you go to an election, and what is the currency in elections? It is votes, isn't it? And the Supreme Court is telling you that Supreme Court, comprising justices of the Supreme Court who cannot even come out of their bedrooms to vote on election day, who have never gone to campaigns and will not listen to the soapbox, they are telling you that the votes of citizens, many of whom have to jump hoops and survive attacks on themselves to vote, the votes of citizens are wasted votes. Zamfara State, wasted votes. Imo State, wasted votes. Bayelsa State, wasted votes. And so we are installing people on the basis of judicial pronouncements whom the people roundly rejected. In Zamfara State, Matawale lost in every ward and became governor because Supreme Court decided that the votes that beat him were wasted. And lawyers will come and tell you, this is Supreme Court, it is final. It cannot be final in a democracy. This is
how not, Chidi? How is it not final if we've been taught that the Supreme Court position is indeed final? What else can we do as citizens? What can we do as associations, as groups, to ensure that it's not final? Because in our minds, all we know is that once the Supreme Court rules, that's it. You go back and you wait for another 4 years. What in concrete terms can people listening, people who are going to watch this later, do? How do we organize in a place where civil society organizations, in some cases, are extensions of the government itself, where the people are so poor that they can't think straight, where the people are so poor that they can't really protest? Where then lies the hope? How do we organize?
Patrick, I'm sure you're not a big man. I mean, you're physically imposing, right? But I don't think you have $2 billion in the bank or $2 million in the bank.
I'm still praying. We're still doing the fasting and prayer.
So this thing about the question is, do we want to suffer intergenerational poverty, or do we want to give our next generation a chance? Because then if we do, we've got to take a risk. We can't be making love and producing children just who are going to become slaves to people here. That's my problem. And when people ask me, why are you this virulent? I say, because I made love and lost my virginity and produced children. And I ask myself the question, what kind of country am I going to live for these children? It's not a country like the one I lived in, because I lived in a country in which I could protest. I lived in a country in which, from a point of view. And I'm now in a country in which my children go to university and my mentees go to university from year 1 to year 5, come out, and they have never disagreed with anything in their lives. What kind of society is that? So it seems to me those of us who have seen a different kind of country have a duty to begin to think. Because if you're in Nigeria where life expectancy is 51, 52 and falling, and you're 40, you should begin to think very rapidly of replacing yourself. You should think of your successors. So as a legacy project, I do think we really do have responsibilities here. And this is not about gratuitous insult to anybody. It's really about the sustenance of our generations. And as I begin to think about that, I do think our responsibilities are very immense and very far-reaching. And so now, yes, it is true indeed. The Supreme Court is said to be doctrinally final. But in these cases where the consequences of the decision really resonate in terms of ruination on the country, it cannot be. We've got to continue to sustain the argument. And that's why I tell the students whom I teach, there are 4 courts. We get stuck in one, we miss the bigger issue. There is court of law. That's the one in which the Supreme Court is final. But that's not the only court. There's the court of public opinion. There is the court of posterity, and there's the court of the Lord. Right? And in a country like Nigeria, where everybody tells you that what God cannot do does not exist, even God himself, therefore, can overrule the bloody Supreme Court. And but more than that, the people can overrule the Supreme Court. And I say this because for those who followed the 1983 electoral adjudication, there were 2 riggings that struck in the imagination of the country. One was an old Anambra State. NPN stole the elections, installed Christian Ono as governor. The other was the old Ondo State. NPN stole the election from UPN and installed Akin Omoboriowo as winner. What changed? In Ondo State, the Yoruba people of Ondo State decided the state will burn if the theft was sustained. In Anambra State, the Igbo people of old Anambra decided this matter is for the politicians. Everybody collected their Oba and ended up in the market. There was peace in Anambra State, and Ondo State was burning. The issues were absolutely the same, and the judgments came down on the same day. In Ondo State, the Supreme Court decided, no, we will not supply petrol to these matches. And so what did they do? By a vote of 6-1, they overturned the election declared in Ondo State, returned the mandate to UPN. By a vote of 6-1, they sustained the election in Anambra State and returned Christian Ono as winner. The will of the people of Ondo frightened the Supreme Court in 1983. Anambra State people did not have any will to frighten the Supreme Court. The will of the people in these cases can cascade into consequences. That is the outcome of what happened. That's the lesson I draw from that.
Do we live in a different world? In 83, the people, the circumstances, etc. in 83 seem to be, I'm not making excuses, I'm just exploring, seem to be radically different from what we have today in 2025. People are much poorer today. People are so jaded today that I remember when we were back in school, university activism, etc., you felt like if you were protesting against military rule, even if you got shot, even if you died or whatever, society would change. But today, there's a sense that you fight, you lose your life, you get injured. The people who are feeding on the system keep feeding on the system. So the examples you've given seem to me to be from a completely different era, and that the challenges we face today cannot be solved with that same level of thinking. What is wrong with my understanding of this situation?
Well, I'll give you another example from 2023, much more recent. In 2023, the president of the Court of Appeal, who comes from Plateau State, sent a judicial hit squad to Plateau State and robbed the PDP of all the seats they won and handed them to the APC. Yes? Except one seat, the governorship. After they had robbed the PDP of all the parliamentary seats, there were governorship elections petitions waiting to be decided at the Supreme Court. The 3 coincided. 3 major governorship petitions came to decision at the same time. One was Plateau, the other was Zamfara, and the other was Kano. Yes? What linked all of these? These were 3 centerpieces of violence in Nigeria. In Kano, everybody was getting their petrol cans ready. In Plateau, mass killings were ongoing. In Zamfara, people were getting their den guns ready. And Supreme Court looked at Kano in particular and decided it was too far. Because if the Supreme Court had handed that to APC, as some people were minded to tell them to do, there would be no, heavens will not fall, as somebody said. Kano would have been burned beyond recognition. In Plateau State, things were going to happen if they took the governorship and handed it to APC. And there are times when even judges, judiciaries that are bandit, will not allow themselves to go beyond particular points. And part of this problem is, by the way, if your life is so desperate as what you've imagined or what you've described, what else do you have to lose?
Yep.
What else do you have to lose? So at some point as citizens, we've got to say enough is enough. And you see now, going back to what we discussed, what I call the genitalization and filialization of the judiciary, because, fact, now that people are appointing those whom they sleep with, that is people with whom they have genital contact, right? That's genitalization. And people who are from their families, that's filialization. So, you see, with that, you're not even, now, first of all, and this is a point I make in the book, first of all, elections are supposed to be decided in the polling units.
Yeah.
Now, we move them from polling units to the bedroom, where husband and wife, Alabu Kachua, can decide what happens. But it's no longer enough. Now we move them from polling units to courts.
Courtrooms.
Courtrooms. And from courtrooms to bedrooms. Right? When you have moved elections to bedrooms where husband and wife decide who wins and loses, you know you are in a serious difficulty. At that point, something has got to give. And at the minimum, we've got to say that should no longer be the case. We don't need to amend any constitution for that purpose.
And I like the fact that, you've repeated in the book and here, we don't need to, because I think change the constitution, because I think that's work avoidance that happens all the time in Nigeria. When we don't want to solve a problem, we create a big problem, we're going to change the constitution because we know it's a never-ending debate. But I have a question, and I invite our participants to please use the Q&A tab to type in your questions, and I'll read them out and give attribution. I have one from Dr. Folari Badebo-Smith, who interestingly will be my guest in 4 weeks' time to discuss another interesting topic. He says, these cases are not just about the judiciary hijacking the suffrage. It is evidence of overt corruption. The impunity of these cases makes subsequent matters look trivial. The examples speak to the fact that governance is not taught in law schools. What are the chances of public policy being taught at least as an elective? And I even push that to say, shouldn't we be teaching this to all students, in all tertiary institutions, so that we get a sense that our first role as citizens is to be good citizens, but we can't be good citizens if we're not taught what that means. What are your views on this, Chidi?
Totally agree. And when I meet with lawyers these days, I tell them, you can lose your practice license. It doesn't really change who you are. But you cannot lose your Nigerian citizenship because that's decided in the Shugaba case, right? So the first thing, the most important thing is not being a lawyer. And that's why I decide I no longer want to dress in suit and tie. Apologies to Patrick. Because there is a point to be made here. It's okay to be a citizen, and we can be comfortable in that. But we've got to begin to rewire the brains of our younger people, and indeed of our older people, because a senior advocate of Nigeria will now come and tell you, oh, this thing you're saying, the Supreme Court said. For God's sake, I'm not created for the Supreme Court. All right, I'm not that, and we should stop converting citizens into automatons. Oh, if the Supreme Court has not said it, it cannot be done. And it was Bayo Joe who converted us into this thing, because it used to be that if you saw a half-decent judgment or a proper judgment, you knew it. It was Bayo Joe as Attorney General who said, unless it was pronounced positively by the Supreme Court, it can no longer be this. And Bayo Joe's wife is the daughter of a former chief judge. And now, if you take Bayo Joe, former Attorney General of the Federation, his wife is the daughter of James Adesinu. He was the chief judge of Benue State. Her younger sister is a judge in Benue State, sorry, in Ekiti State. Her younger brother is a judge of the FCT High Court. Were they born with judicial genes? Is there anything called a judicial gene? You see, this idea that some families are so blessed, everybody from that family has got to be a judge, is destructive of the society. And any family that is like that should be looked at again. That's the point.
Interesting. I have a question from Ola Mikinde, and it's really about corruption and culture. And the question is, what is the brain behind Japan's consciousness against corruption and corrupt practices, and how can this be imbibed in the Nigerian spirit and system? So I guess the question is really about not, using Japan, but many of these other countries, where corruption is really frowned upon. And is it a cultural thing? Is it a system that was created by the people? How do we change our consciousness around corruption, where it's not something we hear and we say, well, not them, but something we hear and we feel so incensed that we really want to do something about it? How do we get Nigerians to be really incensed around corruption and not just this attitude of, okay, I'm waiting my turn. It's not my turn today. It could be my turn tomorrow. Have you seen societies that really created this, or are we stuck where we are? What are some of your thoughts?
Well, I'll marry it up with the question I saw from Chris, who says, what about jury trials?
Okay.
Because in many ways, we had jury trials in Nigeria until the 1970s, and they didn't work because of the nature of our society. We are a very intrusive society. I'll give you an example. From one of the law faculties in Nigeria that I will not name, there was a dean of law who did things he should not have done. And the students escalated the matter to a point where the dean had to lose his office, and then they started prosecuting the dean. But the president of the law faculty, the Law Students Association, came from the same neighborhood as the dean, the same community. And as a result, his village people decided, his extended family decided to stop his sponsorship. And he could not go to law school because he had supported the students who reported or who took action against who brought consequences upon his kinsman.
Mm-hmm.
I had to raise funds for that guy to go to law school. And we're not from the same village, we're not from the same state, we're not from the same ethnicity, but this is a justice issue. This is a fairness issue. And we've got to mutually support young people, particularly, who face those kinds of consequences. But jury trials cannot work in Nigeria because of our affinities and the networks that come from them and the filial pressures, therefore, that make it impossible for, because the more people you have in a decision-making framework in our society, the more channels of infiltration that you're more likely to create. Now, and the question you ask is, I believe, dealt with by Samuel Huntington in his Clash of, that's actually what he explores in Clash of Civilizations. Mm-hmm. And of course, it deals with Japan as a model, and also a lot of people have studied Japan in relation to its MITI, the trade ministry, and how Japan's system is a lot more consensual than and collegial than the Western system. It's consensual and collegial, built on honor and integrity. And those principles of honor and integrity, which underpin the Japanese system, are not necessarily present in our system anymore. And partly because we have not forged a national ethic. We've not forged a national identity that distills the best of our possibilities into a civic culture. So there's no shared civic culture. Instead, everybody brings the worst of their own respective cultural systems into what should be a civic space. And what's therefore you do, or a civic commons, and what you do have therefore is, in the absence of a shared sense of Nigerianness, what we have is a cannibalization of the commons. And that sense of cannibalization of the commons makes it impossible for us to evince what you're talking about. And which is why I continue to go back to the question about the reason why citizenship is critical. Because if we don't have a shared sense of citizenship, these aspirations that we want, whether it is Fola or yourself or any other person or myself. Those aspirations are going to continue to be like that. And I think we can do better.
Yeah. There's a question from Miriam Menkiti. Prof, please, what can you do to assist in ensuring that law students are taught better to question judgments that are not right? And I know you've spoken about it tangentially, but in more concrete terms, how do we ensure that the curriculum and the way curriculum is taught can change? And how do we ensure that lawyers understand that their role as well is to question some of these bad judgments or bad practices, mindful that they are taking some risks? Are there thoughts on how to build up organizations, institutions that will provide some kind of support for people who do indeed choose to take the risk?
The least risky of everything I've proposed or explored in this conversation I did in the book is reform of legal pedagogy. Quite honestly, it is so basic. There's no risk involved in that. I mean, at the moment, I'm involved in a project in Ghana, unfortunately not in Nigeria, with the University of Ghana to reform legal pedagogy in Ghana. I do think we need to start doing that post haste in Nigeria, because that's really where we do the reprogramming long term. The throughput is not going to come through, it's not going to be evident in 5 years, 10 years, but in a generation, it is going to be, we are going to fundamentally reform the system. And I'm arguing that case now with some people involved in legal education in Nigeria, but it's going to take us a little while. But you can understand what for those who are not lawyers here, listen. When young kids go to the law school, they are taught that Nigeria is comprised by received laws, which are common law, doctrine of equity, and status of general application enforced in England on the 1st of January 1900. This is 2025. Now, the students are required to regurgitate this in order to pass, and you are not entitled to ask, but why is it 1900? Why would we be subjected to this kind of anachronism? If you ask that kind of question, you fail the course. Now, so it doesn't even require reform. All you've got to do is encourage enough teachers to say this is not right. And you see, when I did family law in 1986, I was taught that one of the rights of a husband in a marriage is reasonable chastisement of the wife. That is, you can beat your wife. Today, if you do it, it is called domestic violence. That did not require reform of curriculum. It just meant what? People had to question that doctrine.
Yeah.
And I do think we've got to encourage us. Actually, the women's rights movement has taught us a few things that we can transpose onto precisely what we are talking about now with similar consequences.
I mean, here's another very practical question, and it's from me. You're clearly hopeful about Nigeria, and that's why you keep engaging on all platforms. Writing a book like this is a labor of love, a gift to Nigerians. What gives you hope that we can fix our governance system, despite all the challenges that we've talked about, and that it can lead to development? What gives you that hope? So when you think about it, from where does your hope come? And whatever that hope is, what are the critical 3, 4, 5 elements that must be in place for us to get our governance right?
It's a 5-letter word, YOUTH. The young people give me hope. They are going to kick ass. I swear to you. Whether we like it or not. Look, in a country like this, with 3.2% year-on-year population growth, right? And with the digital possibilities that we've got, the politicians are going to suffer. It may not happen in my lifetime, but it is simple rules of demand and supply. The system cannot supply what these young people are asking for. And we have not learned to use condoms or practice birth control properly. And so we are producing, and if you are producing at 3.2%, you need a growth rate of about 10% to keep pace, because you are basically doubling your population every 15 years or thereabouts. just compound the numbers, you double your population every 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you are in that zone and you are thinking it is business as usual, you're wasting your time.
Sorry.
Because, and that really gives me a lot of hope, because at some point this system is going to crash.
Mm.
And you can actually see how soon this system can crash. And it will crash, it could easily crash in my lifetime.
Mm.
And the only way, therefore, that is left for us to preclude this system from crashing is either we course correct, or we build responsible institutions, or we do both.
Mm.
And so that's why I'm optimistic. I'm very optimistic. Anybody who sees everything you say is totally accurate. I'm very optimistic, because if you follow the metrics and the numbers, you've got to know that this Nigeria does not have another 25 years. No.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, what's the most critical message you want, like, scholars, policymakers, the general public to take away from the book? What is that one most critical message that you'd like everyone to take away from the book, and what would you like them to do with it?
Serviceable institutions are not given, they are fought for. And we've got to fight for institutions to protect us.
Mm.
That basically is the fundamental message. And it is a political project to create institutions that work for everyone. Mm. It is not a technocratic project. That means every citizen has got to take a stake. You see, so when there is a terrible judgment in Zamfara State affecting APC, don't think because you support PDP, it's okay to say that is right. When there is a terrible judgment that affects QED in Lagos State, take an interest, and let us begin to forge coalitions of the willing and the possible across these manufactured divides. Because the elite, I think you started off with government of elite for the elite by the elite. Those elites come from everywhere across Nigeria. They are not defined by ethnicity. They are not defined by faith or sect. And therefore, citizens who want to transform things should not be defined by faith or sect. I think we should forge common interests, and build shared coalitions of the possible. That really is what I take, the message. And the other message is really, we should be interested enough in legal institutions to know that they are too important to be left to lawyers and judges alone.
So I've got a question from Rosalind Anya. She's a lawyer and an intern with us at Nextier, but also a brilliant writer. I have to put that in there. So her question is, given the role that law plays in shaping power structures and enabling or obstructing development, if you were invited to draft a truly people-centered constitution for Nigeria, one designed to confront inequality and institutional dysfunction, what 3 clauses would you insist on including?
Number 1, if I were to be invited, I will not accept. So the question of what 3 clauses I would insist on including will not arise, and I will explain to you why. In Nigeria, the closest we came to making our problem is that we choose to draft constitutions, not to make them. The closest we came to making a constitution was 1977 to 79. But the military stepped in because the conversations really got meaty, and they decided to arrest a conversation that needed to take place. A constitution is not drafted, a constitution is made. And you make it by having the people affected negotiate it and have honest conversations. It can be testy, it can be ugly. But through that process, people will look destitution in the face. They will look destruction in the face, and they will say, we will step back. And we will step back on these premises, on these terms, on these understandings. That will create mutual ownership. And those terms they then agree will be what you write down as a constitution. So constitution making precedes constitution drafting. You draft what has been agreed. And on the day when a dispute arises, you can say, our ancestors said and did. But in Nigeria, we've never had that process. You see, India became independent in 1947, but did not have a constitution until 1950. They spent 3 years negotiating a constitution in a process led by a Dalit, Dr. Ambedkar. Pakistan became independent at the same time and put in place a constitution quickly. Pakistan's constitution never succeeded. India's constitution has never failed because there is a memory. There was a process. India is a lot more complex as a society, but that constitution has held. In Nigeria, we have never made a constitution. We need to make one. If we make a constitution, I will come in to draft what has been agreed. That will be easy. But if you ask me to draft one like Chief Williams and Ben Wabeze were asked to draft one, I will not accept.
Fair point, fair point, fair point. I have a question from Ndu Nwokolo. He's a partner with Nextier. He starts with a quote from Frederick Engel. The state is a product of society at a certain stage of development. Yeah. And he says it is this admission that society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself. Using this belief from Engels, how can we start making our state institutions independent of the government? So first question is, should they be independent of government? And if yes, what does that independence look like? And I think he's probably thinking of this from the angle of what it might, is also confusing for me. You know, we need for the courts to be independent, you know, but we also need to challenge the courts in some of the decisions that come down. You know, so how do we balance what seems like could be a contradiction in my head? Again, I'm not a legal scholar.
You know, it's interesting that the question should start off with Frederick Engels. Engels, of course, was German, and this is the 140th anniversary of the Berlin West Africa Conference this year, you know, which ended in 1885. And why do I say so? Because Engels was not describing African states. He was describing the imperial European states. And European state, particularly the imperial state that he was describing in the late Industrial Revolution phase, is fundamentally different from the African state. And we've got to imagine the possibility of the African state with its antecedents. The African state was an invention, entirely European contraption, which was not allowed to marinate in the African reality. And that essentially was a cartographic exercise that did not equip the people to negotiate the contradictions between the mutual contradictions between the communities comprised in that post-colonial entity. And so if you gave that reality to, say, Tandika Nkandawire, God bless his soul, Tandika will probably not agree with what Engels has put forward. And, you know, of course, Marx and Engels transformed dialectical historical materialism. And the dialectical there was from Hegel, right? And Hegel himself did not think of Africans as human beings. And really, so in historical dialectical materialism did not think of Africans as human beings. And therefore, we've got to reinvent or invent our own dialectical and historical and materialism. That means that people like precisely the colleague who has asked this question have got to start to exercise intellectual agency and moral agency. And as fascinating as the work of people like Engels was, they were responding to their societies. We've now got to start as African intellectuals and thinkers to respond to the realities of our society. And with what is happening globally in the West, Trump there, the emergence of the right in Europe, this is the time. So this time is actually ripe for a new generation of African possibilities, beginning with the kinds of people who have asked the last two questions, people in their 20s, who are going to imagine a new kind of Africa with new possibilities and new tools that were not there when my generation went to school. When my generation went to school, when you came out of the library, you had asthma because the books were on shelves with a lot of dust. Today, you don't need to suffer asthma to get knowledge. All you need to do is sit on your laptop or with your device, and everything is in your palm. So the possibilities are immense, and I do think we need to start encouraging our young people to take those possibilities and run with them.
And there's a question from another young person for you. Anyway, from Roslyn Anya, who's the intern with us. And she said, you often bring history, literature, and culture into your work and commentary. How has fiction or storytelling shaped the way you think about law and justice in Nigeria? And when you're not reading legal texts, what kind of books or stories do you turn to?
You're right. It was actually I had to reteach myself after suffering the indoctrination of the Nigerian law school. And then I actually started discovering, with my limited work in advocacy, that lawyering is actually about storytelling, breaking stories and experiences down in little bits and bytes and packages that other people can understand. And so I took the course of narrative lawyering and narrative teaching. And so breaking these things down in relatable forms, not written for lawyers, but lawyers can richly understand. And in doing that, you then begin to explore angles and discover angles to legal material that people did not have. But one more thing, it becomes a forensic process because you're matching up different things in different places. So, for instance, I've just talked about Berlin West Africa Conference, 140 years, and you then begin to place when you place that date, 1884, 1885, globally, things just resolve in a way that if you have a sense of history, of Industrial Revolution history, what you get is ridiculous. Just the picture, the kaleidoscope that emerges is ridiculous. And it's really what, in terms of what I read, I no longer read fiction because Nigerian reality is more exciting than fiction. I stopped reading fiction. I mean, I'm going to make an exception with Chimamanda's DreamWorks, but that's really an exception. I try not to read fiction anymore because the reality actually that you see in Nigeria just blows your mind. And that's really why I try to reduce that reality into narrative. So, and when people from outside Nigeria, indeed sometimes people from Nigeria read that narrative. For instance, when you read the story of what happened in the Uba brothers case, right? In how Ugochukwu ended up in the Senate, you actually sit back and you say, wow, Obanese's story.
Obanese, I found Obanese's story to be even more intriguing.
Exactly. Or this Justice of the Court of Appeal who was selling beans.
Yes.
Right? Exactly. So a senior judge actually says he went to sell beans, and around selling the beans, then corruption took place. So, the Nigerian reality is fascinating. And so I personally read African memoirs, biographies, and autobiographies of African figures. And I will encourage any young person here to do so. They don't have to come from your village. There may even be people whom you totally loathe on the basis of what you've been told, especially if you've not read them before. So Zik, Awolowo, Fadauna, Kenneth Kaunda. Oh, by the way, I totally recommend Sam Nuyoma's autobiography, Where Others Faltered. It is phenomenal. But read about the lives of other leaders, because we've got to hand this place over to some people. And who better than the young people? And it helps if you begin to read about what others did when they were about your age. Because these days, Patrick, you're there, I'm over 50. Somebody will tell you, oh, you young man, your time will come. When will my time come? Gowon was president as a 30-something-year-old. Murtala Mohammed was martyred at 39. Obasanjo had retired as president as 42. At 44, Buhari had retired as president. At 54, Babangida had retired as president. At 62, Obasanjo had returned on his second journey as president. Today, people are telling you at 60, your time will come.
I just realized that Abacha died in his early 40s.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyways, we're way over time now, but I want to give to you another 30 seconds. Maybe there's something you really want to speak about that we didn't get to.
Not on this occasion. I just want to say thank you. I think you guys at Nextier are doing phenomenal work in very difficult circumstances. And for those who are interested, let's explore these issues because there's dialogue to be had on how we model our institutions. And thank you very much again.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today. Big ideas, important questions, real conversations. Until next time, Patrick Okigbo, let's keep building that society we want to live in. Professor Chidi Odinkalu, thank you so much.